The sirens came without warning. Across northern Israel, families grabbed their children and ran. In central cities, office workers abandoned their desks and sprinted toward stairwells. Elderly residents in apartment buildings struggled toward reinforced rooms as the sound of explosions rolled across the horizon. In a matter of minutes, millions of people were underground, pressed into bomb shelters, listening to the sounds of a war that had just crossed into a terrifying new chapter. Iranian ballistic missiles were falling on Israeli territory. Hezbollah rockets were tearing through communities across the north. Both offensives were happening at the same time, coordinated, deliberate, and designed to overwhelm everything Israel had built to protect itself. This was not a skirmish. This was not a limited exchange. This was a full-scale, multi-front assault on a country of roughly 9 million people, and it changed the nature of this conflict in ways that will reverberate for years. To understand how we arrived at this moment, you have to go back to where this all began. Not because history is just background, but because every missile fired today has its roots in decisions made months and years ago, and understanding those roots is the only way to understand what is actually happening and where it might lead. On October 7, 2023, Hamas launched its attack on Israel. Reuters described what followed as a fresh cycle of violence that rocked the Middle East. That description, accurate as it was at the time, now reads as a significant understatement. What began as a conflict between Israel and Hamas inside Gaza has expanded, step by painful step, into something involving Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, Iranian-backed militias across Iraq and Syria, and now Iran itself firing ballistic missiles directly at Israeli cities. A regional war, the kind that analysts spent years warning could happen if the right combination of miscalculation and escalation took hold, is no longer a theoretical risk. It is the reality that millions of people are living inside right now. The Gaza campaign that Israel launched in response to October 7th was unlike anything the territory had seen before. The scale was enormous, the intensity sustained, and the humanitarian consequences catastrophic. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which is the primary international body responsible for providing humanitarian assistance to Palestinian refugees, confirmed that more than 390 of its own staff members were killed during the conflict in Gaza. The head of UNRWA described this as making it the deadliest conflict in the history of the United Nations for any organization's own personnel. More than 390 people whose entire professional purpose was to carry food, medicine, and shelter to people who had nothing, killed. That number is not a policy argument. It is a statement about the scale of destruction that has been unfolding in Gaza, and it matters because that destruction is one of the driving forces behind everything that has escalated since. While Gaza was being fought over, the northern front was building quietly and lethally. Hezbollah began firing rockets into northern Israel almost immediately after October 7th, framing its actions as solidarity with Gaza and support for Palestinian resistance. The exchanges were significant from the beginning, but initially operated within a kind of informal ceiling of intensity. Over the following months, that ceiling lifted repeatedly. Israel struck Hezbollah commanders in precision operations. Hezbollah responded with larger and more sophisticated rocket barrages. Israel launched ground operations into southern Lebanon. Hezbollah fired rockets deeper into Israeli territory. And tens of thousands of Israelis living in northern border communities were evacuated from their homes, unable to return not for days or weeks, but for more than a year, their towns sitting largely empty because the persistent rocket threat made ordinary life impossible. Hezbollah is not a minor actor in any sense of the word. It is estimated to possess a rocket and missile arsenal of more than 130,000 projectiles, which places it among the most heavily armed non-state actors anywhere on the planet. These are not all unsophisticated weapons. Hezbollah has invested heavily in precision-guided munitions capable of hitting specific targets at meaningful distances. When an organization of that capability decides to launch a sustained offensive in coordination with Iranian ballistic missiles, the defensive challenge it creates is genuinely extraordinary. Israel's air defense system is layered and widely regarded as among the most advanced in the world. The Iron Dome intercepts short-range rockets and artillery shells. David's Sling handles medium to long-range threats. The Arrow system engages ballistic missiles at high altitude. Israeli officials have historically cited Iron Dome's operational interception success rate at approximately 90% under combat conditions, a figure that reflects genuine technological achievement. But that same figure contains a sobering reality. When hundreds of projectiles arrive in coordinated salvos specifically designed to saturate and overwhelm the defense network. Even a 90% success rate means a meaningful number of threats get through. And when what is getting through includes Iranian ballistic missiles and Hezbollah precision rockets, the results are felt in factories, in neighborhoods, in homes, in human lives. Al Jazeera confirmed that drone footage captured a factory in Israel damaged by Iranian missile debris. Air raid sirens sounded across wide stretches of the country simultaneously. Preliminary figures confirmed at least 24 deaths in Israel as a direct result of the strikes. These are not abstract numbers to be processed and set aside. These are people, individuals with names and families and ordinary lives, killed in their homes, their workplaces, their communities, by weapons fired with deliberate intent from hundreds of kilometers away. Iran's decision to launch ballistic missiles directly at Israeli territory is the element of this crisis that carries the most significant long-term implications, and it deserves careful examination rather than simple characterization. For decades, Iran pursued what strategic analysts called a proxy strategy. Tehran funded, armed, trained, and directed Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, and various militias across Iraq and Syria. This approach allowed Iran to project power throughout the region, to threaten its adversaries, and to maintain pressure on Israel and on American allies, all while keeping a layer of distance between itself and the direct consequences of those actions. The proxy model gave Iran influence without exposure, reach without the full weight of retaliation falling on Iranian soil and Iranian people. That model has now fundamentally changed. When Iran fired ballistic missiles at Israeli cities, it stepped out from behind the proxy architecture and into direct military confrontation. It did so knowing that Israel had already demonstrated its willingness to strike back inside Iranian territory. It did so knowing that the United States was closely aligned with Israel and had already been providing significant military support. And it did so in a context where the regional and domestic political pressures on Iranian leadership had apparently reached a point where the calculus of direct action shifted. The United States responded by moving from background support to direct military engagement. Bloomberg reported on American and Israeli forces waging war against Iran together. An American F-15E fighter jet was shot down over Iranian territory, a development that sent immediate shockwaves through international capitals, financial markets, and military command centers around the world. The New York Times confirmed that one American crew member was rescued, while the fate of the second remained initially unclear. The downing of an American military aircraft over Iran is not a footnote. It is a defining moment. It means the United States is no longer a patron providing weapons and intelligence from a distance. It is a direct participant in armed conflict with Iran, and that reality transforms the strategic landscape for every other power that has been watching this situation develop. Russia dismissed international calls to force open the Strait of Hormuz, according to Bloomberg. China demonstrated what Bloomberg described as surprising resilience in managing the economic pressures created by the Middle East crisis. These responses from the world's other major powers tell you something important about how this moment is being read in Moscow and Beijing, and about the limits of international consensus when the stakes are this high and the interests this divergent. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow passage between Iran and Oman through which approximately 20% of all global oil trade flows every single day. Tankers carrying crude oil, liquefied natural gas, and refined petroleum products pass through this waterway in a continuous stream that keeps economies functioning across Asia, Europe, and beyond. The possibility that Iran might attempt to close or significantly restrict passage through the strait in response to military pressure is one of the most consequential economic threats attached to this conflict. The United States moved to double its security guarantees for Hormuz passage to $40 billion with new international partners, a commitment that reflects how seriously American planners are taking this scenario. The economic consequences of what is happening are already spreading far beyond the people directly in the path of missiles and rockets. Bloomberg reported that oil prices were rising sharply. France was weighing targeted fuel aid for its citizens as energy costs climbed. Turkey was considering raising energy prices. Egypt's currency was absorbing significant damage. In the United States, farmers were being pushed toward financial crisis as fertilizer prices soared just before planting season, a consequence of supply disruptions tied directly to the conflict. Amazon added a seller surcharge to account for rising logistics costs. The American Strategic Petroleum Reserve was tapped for additional millions of barrels as war fears drove prices upward. The economic threads connecting a war being fought in the Middle East to the daily lives of ordinary people in dozens of countries are visible and tightening. Lebanon's situation deserves specific and sustained attention because what is happening to that country is a tragedy operating within a tragedy. Lebanon is not Iran. Lebanon is not a military power pursuing regional dominance. Lebanon is a small country with a complex and fragile internal political balance, a country that has already survived multiple devastating conflicts, a country whose population includes people with deeply divided views about Hezbollah and its decision to engage in this war. Al Jazeera reported on how Israel's campaign against Hezbollah is pitting Lebanon against itself, a characterization that captures something real about the internal Lebanese experience of this conflict. There are Lebanese citizens who support Hezbollah's actions and see them as resistance. There are Lebanese citizens who are furious that Hezbollah has once again brought destruction to their country without a national decision or democratic mandate. And there are Lebanese civilians across that spectrum who are now watching infrastructure destroyed, healthcare facilities damaged, and bridges threatened, all as consequences of a military confrontation they did not choose. Israel's military objectives in Lebanon have been stated clearly. The goal is to degrade Hezbollah's capability to threaten northern Israeli communities to the point where the tens of thousands of displaced Israelis can safely return to their homes. That is a legitimate objective from Israel's security perspective. The methods used to pursue it, and the consequences for Lebanese civilian infrastructure and civilian lives, are what have drawn sharp international criticism and generated calls for accountability through international legal mechanisms. The international community's response to all of this has been, to put it plainly, inadequate to the scale of the crisis. Statements have been issued. Concern has been expressed. Individual leaders have taken strong positions that differ significantly from one another. The European Union called various Israeli legislative actions very concerning. 8 Muslim-majority countries formally condemned Israel's passage of a law making the death penalty the default sentence for Palestinians convicted in military courts of deadly attacks, a law the United Nations stated violated international law, and which Spain's prime minister described as a step toward apartheid. France's Emmanuel Macron criticized the American approach and called on European allies to present a unified alternative. None of these responses have stopped a single missile or changed a single military decision on the ground. On the question of what peace might eventually look like, the gaps remain enormous. Reuters reported that Hamas told mediators it would not discuss giving up its weapons without firm guarantees that Israel would fully withdraw from Gaza. This position was in response to a disarmament plan put forward by the Trump administration's diplomatic team, a plan that envisioned Hamas laying down its weapons in stages over 8 months, while Gaza's vast tunnel network, built over decades beneath the territory, would be systematically destroyed. The distance between what Hamas was demanding and what Israel was willing to commit to remained as wide as it has ever been, and the broader regional escalation involving Iran and Hezbollah was making any near-term diplomatic resolution even harder to construct. For the Israelis living in the north who spent more than a year evacuated from their homes, watching the Hezbollah and Iranian offensive unfold is confirmation of a fear that never fully went away even during the quieter periods. These are communities that were told military operations would eventually create the conditions for a safe return. That promise has not been fulfilled. With rockets falling again in larger numbers and Iranian missiles added to the threat, the timeline for any return to normal life has become impossible to predict. Al Jazeera quoted Israelis asking how much more they can take. That question is not rhetorical. It is the genuine expression of a population that has been living under the shadow of this conflict for an extended period, that has watched its northern communities emptied, that is now running to shelters across the center of the country as well, and that has no clear sense of when or how this ends. The psychological weight of sustained conflict, of sirens and shelters, and not knowing whether the next strike will land near someone you love, is real and cumulative and not adequately captured in the geopolitical analysis that tends to dominate coverage of events like these. And yet the full picture of human suffering here extends in multiple directions simultaneously. And intellectual honesty requires holding that complexity rather than simplifying it. The Gaza conflict produced a humanitarian catastrophe whose dimensions are still being fully understood. UNRWA's confirmation that more than 390 of its own humanitarian workers were killed established a grim record in the history of international conflict. Babies who had been evacuated from Gaza as premature infants, too fragile to survive without medical care that Gaza itself could not provide, were only just being reunited with their parents 2 years later, their families having been separated for the entirety of those children's early lives. Soccer returned to a war-scarred pitch in Gaza, Jabalia Youth against Al-Sadaqah, the territory's first organized tournament in more than 2 years, a fragile and profoundly human moment of something resembling normalcy in the middle of ruins and rubble. These details matter. They are not distractions from the geopolitical story. They are the actual content of what war means when it lands on real human beings who were simply trying to live their lives. The path forward from where we are now depends on decisions being made in this very moment in Tehran, in Tel Aviv, in Washington, in Moscow, in Beirut, and in international institutions that are struggling to find relevance in a crisis that has outpaced their mechanisms. Iran must calculate whether the costs of direct military confrontation, the strikes on Iranian infrastructure, the economic pressure, the casualties, justify the strategic and domestic political benefits it draws from this posture. Israel must determine how far its military campaign can extend before the costs in international legitimacy, in regional stability, and in human life on all sides outweigh the security objectives it is pursuing. The United States, now at war with Iran in a direct and undeniable sense, must weigh the risks of further escalation against the risks of any movement that could be read as weakness or retreat by adversaries who are watching every signal carefully. The broader international community faces a choice that it has been deferring for too long. Either it applies the kind of sustained, unified, and genuinely consequential diplomatic pressure that creates space for political solutions to emerge, or it continues to issue statements while the conflict expands into territory from which return becomes progressively harder and more costly for everyone. The Strait of Hormuz, Gulf energy infrastructure, global food prices, fertilizer supplies, currency values across the developing world, all of these are now connected to what happens in the next few days and weeks in the skies over Israel and in the military command rooms of Tehran, Washington, and Tel Aviv. The people who are not in those command rooms, the Israeli families underground listening to explosions above them, the Lebanese civilians watching their country absorb consequences they did not choose, the Palestinian families in Gaza trying to find something to hold on to in the wreckage of what their lives used to be, the Iranian citizens whose healthcare infrastructure and civilian amenities have been targeted, none of them made the decisions that led to this moment. None of them voted for ballistic missiles or rocket barrages. None of them drew up the plans or gave the orders. And all of them are paying the price that those decisions carry in ways that are immediate and physical and permanent. This is where we are. This is what is actually happening when you strip away the political framing and the competing narratives and look at what the evidence from Reuters, Bloomberg, Al Jazeera, and the New York Times confirms on the ground. Iranian missiles struck Israeli territory. Hezbollah rockets struck Israeli communities from the north simultaneously. An American fighter jet was shot down over Iran. Gulf infrastructure was hit. Energy markets are moving. Economies are feeling the pressure. Families are separated, displaced, grieving, afraid. Understanding all of that clearly without looking away from any part of it, without collapsing it into a simple story that fits comfortably on one side of a political argument, is not just an intellectual exercise. It is the foundation of any honest attempt to think about what kind of future might still be possible for a region that has known far too much of what we are seeing unfold right now. The decisions made in the coming days will shape not just the Middle East, but the international order for years beyond it. And the people living through those decisions deserve to have the world understand exactly what is being done in their name and at their expense.